My name is Rose Friedman, and I run the Civic Standard, and we are the current owners of 42 South Main Street. So I'm going to just give a brief story about how we came to be the owners and why we called for this meeting. We moved into the building about 3 years ago, almost exactly. I think it was in June that we actually got the keys. And that happened because we were starting this small organization and wanted a space in the downtown on Main Street, and we're coming up against the limitations of the properties there and our very tiny budget. And we saw that the Gazette building had been sitting empty for about 6 months. So the paper moved out of there during COVID. Shortly after they moved out, the pipes burst in the basement, and that was a pretty substantial amount of water that came out of there and needed to be cleaned up. And then it was sort of buttoned up and closed down. So we approached Ray Small, who was the owner at the time of both the building and the Gazette, and asked if we could basically alleviate all of his carrying costs by moving into the building and just paying for all the utilities and the insurance and the taxes. We couldn't afford a whole rent on top of that, but we thought, hey, while you're waiting to figure out what to do with the building, or maybe you're going to put it on the market, in the meantime, could we just take up residence in it? And he surprisingly said yes, he would be amenable to that. We could try it. Started with a year. Almost immediately we said, could we actually make it 18 months? And then after about 18 months, he decided that he would donate the building to us, because at that point we were a 501c3. It took us about that long to become that. And he felt like it was probably a better bet for him to take the tax write-off and also to hand it off as it was to people who were ready to sort of clean it up and do what we could with it. So we started with a pretty substantial cleanup of the building, and then just did a lot of little bits of fixing up and maintenance that we could afford. And slowly we put in a little bit more maintenance. We got some funding to replace the electrical panel and things like that. But for the most part, we have spent the last 3 years doing a tremendous amount of programming out of that building and organizing work, and making it nicer to be in there, making it more comfortable, and doing what we can to make it more efficient and accessible. And now we are at this point, which is that the foundation is in need of repair, or restoration, or some kind of protection, as the last couple of summers of flooding have worn away a lot of the land that's behind the building and made it a lot more vulnerable to future flooding events. That's the number one safety concern with the building right now. It's a very old, funky building. There's a lot of other concerns down the line, which are, fall under the category of safety and accessibility and efficiency, and also just general functionality. The insurance company that covers us has said that we must paint the exterior and replace the roof if we want to continue to have coverage. And we have kicked that can a couple of times, and we're kind of running out of time on kicking that can any further. So those are two substantial costs that are coming very soon if we want to continue to have building insurance. And that, I think, is the full, very brief picture of what the building is now. So the Civic Standard, which is a 501c3, is the owner of the building right now. And the whole time that we've been in there, we've been working with Preservation Trust to understand and sort of identify the resources that are available to us, and just understand how you even handle the repair and maintenance of an old building. And Jackson Evans, who's sitting right here, is our field rep, who's made, I can't even imagine how many trips up to Hardwick, and had such bad coffee on our couch so many times, and talked to us so patiently about all these possibilities, and has offered a tremendous amount of resources to us in terms of introductions and funding sources and applications we could pursue. So I'm going to sort of hand it over now to Preservation Trust, and then hand it down the line to Kristen Leahy, who's our zoning administrator here, who can talk more about the kind of bigger picture from a municipal point of view.
Great. Well, actually, thanks, Rose. My name's Ben Doyle. I'm the president of the Preservation Trust of Vermont. And thanks for everybody for coming out on a beautiful day. I think it speaks to the importance of this topic, and just really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts here. And I'll be brief and then turn it over to Jackson, who's really been involved in this project. But I just want to speak really at a broader level of like why we're so interested in this building and why we wanted to be a part of this conversation today. Our mission at the Preservation Trust of Vermont is to build community through the preservation of historic buildings, villages, and downtowns. And that looks a lot of different ways, but essentially we try to help people preserve or maintain or save the buildings that they really care about when that's possible, right? And we work across the state. Last year we worked on over 360 projects in 152 towns. We've had a long history in Hardwick on a lot of different projects in this town. And personally, before I worked at Preservation Trust, I worked at USDA Rural Development and did a lot of work in Hardwick. And I know what a strong town this is, and just really appreciate the leadership and really the way in which you've been able to foster community using this building. I mean, really, in a lot of ways, that's what our organization is all about, is trying to help people do that. I will say that, I feel like I've been in this job 5 years. My predecessor was here for 45. I feel like the next 45 years are really going to be responding to what we've seen over the past 2 summers. I live in downtown Montpelier. Flooding is meaningful to me, and I know it is to all of you. And I feel like the world has really shifted. We've been talking about climate change for a really long time. It's here. And so, what does that mean for a state that's has historic settlement patterns along rivers? It's extremely challenging. And, we're having this conversation really all over the state, whether it's in Montpelier or Barre or Ludlow or Chester, Wilmington, all over, And I think that there's going to be, new technologies that are going to need to be used, new approaches, but also just realistic conversations about what is the realm of the possible. And, I really appreciate the civic standard and the kind of journey that they're on to ultimately be a good steward of the building. Because that's all we really are, right? Are stewards of buildings. And what that journey looks like, or that stewardship looks like, can shift over time and can end in different places. But the reason that we're here tonight is because we really want to be a part of a positive and proactive conversation about what does stewardship of this building look like right now. And this conversation, or this, frankly, building could go a lot of different ways, right? But from our point of view, we want to give it a chance, right? And stewardship to us means running out all the options, looking at all the different alternatives. Is there a way that this building can safely be preserved for the future and continue to play an important role in Hardwick's downtown? If that is possible, we want to do everything we can as an organization to support this community in stewarding that building. If it's not possible, if we, do look at the engineering, we look at the science, we, have run it all out and explored all the options and recognized there's no real safe way to do this, there's no way to mitigate the risk to a level that feels comfortable, we'll acknowledge that and work with you to find a respectful alternative, right? I mean, that's really kind of where we are. We believe that if there's a chance to save this building, we should try. And if not, we should look at, different alternatives. And we're seeing, again, I think this is a conversation we need to have as a state. But I also think we're not just about the individual buildings. We're about the sense of community and vitality around a village or a downtown. And that's why conversations like this one are so important, that, how we steward this building to the next stage of whatever its life is will say a lot about just, how we all work together as a community in these kind of challenging times. So that's like stuff at a very high level. I can do that all day long and would be happy to continue. But Jackson is really the person that, this guy wears a civic standard hat to work. Like, he's really loves this project and has spent a lot of time working with them on this building. And so, Jackson, if you want to just talk about the history of what that kind of intervention has looked like, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, and I thought I would give a tiny little historical background on the building. Wiz is in the front row, so I'm not going to try to talk about Hardwick history to any real degree. But the building was built circa 1850. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places as part of the Hardwick Downtown Historic District, which was listed in 1982. It's purported to be the oldest building left in the downtown district. A massive fire in 1923 wiped out a lot of Main Street, and then the floods in 27 took out a lot of other buildings. Sure, let me try this microphone. Can people hear me in the back now?
That's just for the camera. Yeah.
All right, I'll try to speak up. It's not important for its architectural style. It's a vernacular building. It doesn't display any sort of high degree of architectural detail. It's important as a piece of the broad history, the broad pattern of development. Vermont, our downtowns and villages are made up of vernacular buildings, and that's kind of what makes them interesting. They tell the story of the working class buildings, the buildings that were there to serve commerce on a busy Main Street, and then eventually the important local newspaper. So the building's worn a lot of hats over its lifetime. I'm sure Wiz can tell you all about the different hats, but that's another talk. So if there's, I think, given the fact that the building has survived major fires, survived flooding, if there's a story that building tells, it's about perseverance and survival, and I think that's an interesting piece of we're writing an interesting piece of that story right now. So like Rose said, we started working, Preservation Trust started working with Civic Standard in July of 2022. I think that was when I first came down and had the first bad cup of coffee. But since then, we've been able to provide technical assistance on everything from getting a general condition assessment of the building done by a local architect who came through and did sort of a basement to attic inspection of the building and wrote up a detailed report which identified priorities for repair, both short and long term, and put some broad cost estimates on that. We helped with that through a matching grant. We also provided some support after the flood with a flood assessment done by the same architect who had been there 6 months earlier, and a structural engineer who came and looked over the building, determined sort of where the water level had come up to, and because there were recent photographs, was able to compare conditions before and after the flooding. And the conclusions of both the original condition assessment that was done prior to the flood is that the building's in relatively sound condition. It suffers from a lot of deferred maintenance, but overall, with a few things like taking care of the roof, repairs to the foundation, some basement support systems, the building would be, in a decent state of preservation. That doesn't bring it up to life safety code. That doesn't bring it up to ADA. Those would be longer term approaches. But by and large, the building was in good condition. And beyond the bank scouring that took away a lot of the material from behind the foundation after the flood of 23, there wasn't there was no adverse conditions that were observed after that flood that weren't there prior to the flood. It doesn't mean it got any better, but it didn't get worse. The key, and the other thing, it's interesting, I always get confused looking at the building because there's this big foundation concrete wall at the back. But that's where the concrete ends and the wood begins. That's the floor of the basement. So when you're standing on the floor of the basement, you're actually standing on top of all the concrete and stone at the back. And the flood waters were about a foot below the basement floor level. So just for reference as you're thinking about it. And then in most recent history, we've been working with Rose to work with a structural engineer to design initially some armoring measures that would protect the foundation from future flooding, and we've since shifted that to looking at doing the immediate repair work on the foundation and in the basement. So that's kind of where we're at today. I think, is there anything else that would be helpful for me to add?
No, that's great.
This is I get to work with a lot of amazing groups around the state of Vermont. The Civic Standard's one of the most high capacity groups and has the best, worst coffee. And, I'm really proud to say that I get to help out and come down and hang out with these great people and see the work that they do. And it's honestly, I take the lessons that I've learned from the Civic Standard and share them with other groups that we work with around the state. And more than once, I've emailed Rose and connected her to groups that I'm working with to say, can you help these people figure out how to do amazing things in their communities? So we're happy to be here. like Ben said, this is an important statewide conversation that we're having, and I think this could be a really interesting case study in how we think about historic buildings in downtowns that are threatened by floods. So.
Yay.
You're gonna make me do it. I'm Kristen Leahy. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Hardwick. Am I speaking loud enough for you back there?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay. I'm the Hardwick Zoning and Floodplain Administrator. Prior to July 2023, I had lots of conversations with Rose and the Civic Standard. I didn't get any bad coffee because you came to my office. But so one of the things to understand is that this building is in what we call the floodway. And so we have the floodplain, and most of the buildings in Hardwick are in the floodplain. And that is where the water is where buildings could flood, but usually it's more of a dispersal. The water's going to come out and go up. The floodway, and we have a river scientist in the room, so if he wants to correct me, I hope he does. The floodway is where it is faster, and the velocity of the water is much more intense. The Civic Standard is in the floodway. There are very few buildings that are in the floodway in Hardwick at this very moment. We have new maps coming out, and some properties are going to be moving into the floodway. Another example of a floodway is a building that's down on right off of Wolcott Street. The owners in 2023 had 8 feet of water in 10 minutes and got out with nothing. So, and in Hardwick in 2023, we had extensive flooding, and we started looking at who had been flooded before, who was in the floodplain. Some of the people who were flooded were not in the floodplain, but we were just, like the Inn by the River is not in the floodplain, just, it wasn't. And we had the opportunity to offer people a buyout. And the buyout has been in existence for quite a while, but previously there was a match. The town would have to come up with 25%. The owners, federal would be 75%, and the owners would get the amount, and we would get the money part of that money would take the building down, part of that money would pay the owners a value before the flooding. And in 2023, the state announced that they'd be matching. They would be providing that 25% match. So we opened up the buyout program to anyone who had been flooded. And some of the people, in the first year, it was 10 people who took that opportunity. The second year, in 2024, 9 more people took that opportunity. And the Civic Standard was the 20th. So 20 properties altogether. We're in different places with each of them. They are all going to be paid 100% by funds either from the state or from FEMA. And after this, we don't know what's going to happen, if there's going to be a match from the state for that 25%. So, for example, we've had 3.1 million come in to do some of these purchases and demolitions. They get the value of the property prior to the day that it flooded. So it's a sizable amount of money to help make them whole. The program is out of money. It was nearing the end of its money when I talked to Rose about what was going on down in their house, the amount of money they were going to be spending to bring it into compliance with just their insurance, not flood insurance, regular insurance, and offered this as a possibility, given that we are seeing changes in the middle of the corridor. So in 2023, we had the flooding, and after the flooding, large swaths of Route 15 were damaged, and the V-Trans protected the Route 15 and parts of the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail with extensive riprap. When you put in extensive riprap, the large stones, you have erosion downstream. So now in 2024, in July of 2024, one of the properties on Brush Street and the Brochu property both lost, which are both in the center of town, right near where the Civic Standard is. They both lost extensive pieces of their property. And then in August 2024, which was not a declared storm for us, the structure up on the hill lost a large section and has been deemed not habitable by the state geologist. So we know that things are changing in there. And as a town, we submitted a large grant to look at the whole corridor, because every time we do a change in a piece in the corridor, it impacts something else. So we wanted to do a full plan and do a phased approach. And the first numbers we had back was $10 million to do that, to do the plan. But to do the plan was $230,000. But to actually implement the plan would be about $10 million. Unfortunately, that was requested through the BRIC program, which is no longer in existence. So the project is still at the state Vermont Emergency Management. They truly believe that this would be a good project. It's a critical. They view it as a critical project, but they don't have funding for it right now in the planning stage. That's the sort of thing we are hoping can be brought forth and to look at what is going on with the Civic Standard. When we met last week with different ideas, the floodplain manager kept reminding us all that everything that you do to that building could impact another building on the corridor. And that's the last thing we want to see happen. So we're working on it. We're really trying to, I've taken more people than I can count to the other side of that river to see what's going on there and to work with them. We are buying out the two structures on Brush Street that are falling into the water. One of them already has its money, the 41 Brush Street, which is the one that burned. That one and the small barn garage structure will both be coming down this summer. The other one is at FEMA. We don't know. Hopefully it will come back with money. We don't know. Everything that we thought we spent a year figuring out how to work the process, and then the process changed. So the buyout program does take a while. I have people from 2023 who are just being bought out this year. I anticipate that this is going to take at least 2 years. And the nice part about the project, the buyout program, is that you can step out anytime up to the closing. So this was not saying we are definitely going to buy it and demolish it. It was just locking a place. It was a placeholder, essentially. It was one of the last buildings to be accepted into the buyout program with that 100% match. It has a spot. It has been sent over to FEMA, but it doesn't have to happen. It was more that if we're trying to have the discussion, we needed to make sure that all the options were still available, and that was one of the options. So I know that some people were concerned that it felt like we did it very quickly. It was not meant to be cutting down the conversation. It was meant to secure that spot.
Get us in
because
there, yeah.
Literally the next day, I was informed that if we had waited one more day, we wouldn't have been in.
So just to little bit summarize where we are right now, we are holding multiple possibilities simultaneously. And so what I've been doing for a while now is moving like many different versions of this forward with the same kind of energy and application, right? So we've been simultaneously looking at what would happen if it became clear that this building was not salvageable, or if we move out of the building and there's nobody who wants to take it on, and we determine through a community process that the building has reached the end of its life. What I don't want is that the town is responsible financially, like that we have to just go, well, we can't deal with it, taking down a building that's got of, lead and various other issues. It's going to be a project. So this opportunity to have that funding completely covered, we wanted to make sure we got in that program in case that's the best option. At the same time, we're looking at funding sources and possibilities for the different ways we could address the foundation issue, which range from a kind of a quick fix for the most vulnerable corner, all the way up to like lifting and rebuilding underneath it, and everything in between. And we also are looking at, the bigger picture of what the building needs and ways we could approach that. So maybe I'll let you guys talk a little bit about like the Freeman Foundation and that process. But I just want to reiterate, like, everything is still possible. We haven't closed any doors yet, but it does feel like we are coming into the sort of runway of like needing to go one direction or the other.
Can I do one?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Because this property is in the floodway, it's held to a much higher standard than any other property in this town, literally. If you are doing something, if you're changing the windows inside, you have to go to the Development Review Board. Nobody else in the town has that. Even in the floodplain, you have up to 50% before you have, if you do repairs or improvements that go 50% of your value, then you have to go to the Development Review Board. If you're in the floodway, like this building, you are expected to take out a Development Review Board permit, which means you also have to be working with the state, and you're working with the stream alteration if it's anything on the external. And our rules say that if you are doing anything around the building, it cannot change the flows around it. So you're held to a very high standard when you're working in the floodway.
Could I ask?
No.
Claire?
No, go ahead.
When you talked about the buyout being the full amount, is that appraised value?
It's
the
appraised,
town
it's
assessment?
appraised value. We don't use assessment value. We use assessment value to gauge how much your repairs are, because we have assessment value for everyone. But we use, it's a separate appraiser who comes out.
That's what I wanted to clarify.
Yep.
Secondly, you said the program is out of money. Is that the 20% match, the federal money, or both?
It's the 2023 allocation that came from FEMA and the match.
Go for it.
Okay, well, the first thing I actually just want to say is, I don't know how to say it other than like, thank you, Kristen, for like, I think actually you doing a difficult job really well, right? And I think like what we've actually done here is saved space for a conversation. And I think frankly, it does make sense to get in line while there's funding available. And full disclosure, like we're actually, the Preservation Trust, we're actually part of a buyout program in a historic building in Montpelier that we have an easement on. These are the kinds of conversations that need to happen. And I appreciate the ability to have a civil conversation about a challenging issue and the professionalism with which it's happening. In terms of funding related to this, I think if I were on the other side of this table and I was thinking, are my taxes going to the...
Yeah.
I would, the Preservation Trust of Vermont, we're a private nonprofit organization. We're funded by philanthropic donations, and we administer some subgrants through National Park Service or other federal funds. We also administer a lot of grant programs through kind of family foundations that support our work and that we then subgrant out on different projects. And, we've done, frankly, a lot of that in Hardwick on different buildings of historic nature in the community. In this case, we had kind of allocated a grant, a pretty significant grant, to help bring the civic standard, up to a preservation level. Really, but I can't remember if that was before the flood. Or
It was after.
It was after the flood. Yeah. And we kind of have allocated that funding to help with the project. And that's, again, those are private philanthropic funds. They're not coming from tax dollars, right? They're made possible by people who believe in this kind of work, and we're committed to doing that. In these conversations with the Civic Standard, I think we're all very cognizant of the fact that, like, preserving an old building is not in the mission statement of the Civic Standard, right? Like, that's not necessarily what they do. And yet, sometimes buildings choose us, and we are their stewards for a time. And I think that that's the situation, the Civic Standard finds itself in now. And at the Preservation Trust of Vermont, we are committed to helping them be good stewards in trying to, again, run this out. And what that means is we've made a commitment on the kind of feasibility planning, the studying, like what are the questions that need to be answered to know if this building can be saved safely? How do we know that we can mitigate risk to protect other people and places along the river corridor? Those kinds of things, we've made a commitment to try and support through our own funding for this project. And then, should there be a repair that's identified that could, stabilize the building, or, this is the kind of work that we do. We work with communities all the time to think about strategies or technologies to preserve a building that's in danger. That's the kind of thing that we would continue to do here. Doesn't mean that there's a, blank check here but it does mean that we see the importance of this building in downtown Hardwick, and we really want to work with the Civic Standard to be the best stewards of the building that they can be during this time. And so we've made the financial commitment to help them do that.
Would you repeat the question instead of having me fall over there? The question is, when will you know when you have an answer about whether the building can be saved?
Great question. Jackson?
So the request,
You have to repeat
the question was, when will you know when you've reached a point and you have to say the building can't be saved? Or can be saved. Thank you,
And
Wiz.
that's with Dow.
Yeah, Wiz Dowd. That's a tough one. Where there's a will, there's a way, but also you have to balance what's financially prudent to invest in a building of any kind. And that's a question that the organization has to make. That's a question of what funding might be available to take on that project. I think I come from a historic preservation background. I believe almost anything can be saved, so I may not be the right person to ask, but I think what we're trying to do is provide as much information as possible through structural engineering assessments, which then lead to estimates of what it would take to do such a project, and providing as much of that as we can to the Civic so that they can make that decision. It's not a Preservation Trust decision to make. It's how much information can we provide so that an informed decision can be made. We may advocate one way or another, but it's not our choice. At the end of the day, it's not our decision.
Thank you.
Jackson, would you mind talking a little bit just about, in terms a little bit more about Bob's work and, short-term stabilization versus kind of longer-term options that we discussed earlier this week?
Sure. We've connected the Civic Standard with Bob Neild, who's a probably 40-year veteran of doing historic preservation-related and non-preservation-related engineering projects around the state. He is the founder and works at Engineering Ventures, and he's done everything from designing this armoring project, which would be out in the river protecting the base of the foundation, to now shifting to looking at both short-term kind of how do we stabilize the corner of the concrete part of the foundation that doesn't have any material under it anymore, and then also stabilize the stone, the dry laid stone foundation on the upriver side. So he's put together some initial drawings, which we're preparing to put into the DRB application. And so that's kind of the short term. Do this so that the next time we get a big flood, you're not further undermining that foundation. The other part of that would involve some interior supports in the basement. Anyone who went down in the basement saw there's some old Lally columns that are, doing their job admirably, but probably could use a little help. So it'll take some of the stress off that. So those are the short-term solutions. Long-term, obviously, the foundations basically from the street back are in rough shape. And so that project looks like supporting the building, raising it up slightly to maybe level a little bit of the lean out or the pitch in the floor, removing the foundations and putting new foundations in. That could be then underpinned to bedrock or whatever the material is. It's the most sturdy material at the bottom. That's a big project. It's complicated by working in the river. We're not, everybody understands that, but ultimately that's the long-term solution. We've thought of, Ben's come up with some really crazy ideas to suspend it out over cantilevered beams. I mean, there's no limit to what we could come up with here. And creative thinking, this is kind of a problem that beckons creative thinking. So we've been really open. We had a really great open conversation with Kristen and Bob Neal and Sasha Peeler from the River Corridor Manager, and talked about all the different options. So, that's kind of where the thinking's at right now.
Yeah, and I think the goal, right, is to run those out, right, to see which one of those options is viable, feasible, cost-effective. Those are all the kinds of questions that hopefully there's enough time to answer.
Again, one for Kristen.
Okay.
What would the town do if that building were not there? What could the town do if that building were not there?
Okay, so WisDow has asked, what could the town do if the building wasn't there? So the funding source through FEMA has very strict restrictions on the property. Once the deed says we will not do any development. So being that it is in the river and it's next to another park, it could theoretically provide, and I'm not a river scientist, we've been asking if we can do river. On any of the buyouts, we can theoretically do flood storage, flood benching, allow for a little more space for the river. You can have a park, you can't have parking, you can't have anything that's going to potentially go into the water and become an obstacle in the event of a flood.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Can I ask a follow-up to that one?
Yep.
Your response, I believe, assumed that there's a federal buyout and the deed gets the covenants that the federal buyout applies. If there are other options that might not involve a federal buyout, that could remove the building, correct?
Correct. Right now, the
Just
funding.
to make sure we're clear.
So the funding
If we're
source.
looking at giant.
Yeah, so the funding source of the federal buyout, the attraction to it is that it does provide the financial wherewithal to remove the structure, even though it has lead paint and possibly asbestos. Removing the inn by the river was completely full of asbestos. It went from a $25,000 demolition to nearly $200,000. And the program covered that. So shutting down the street, having someone getting the permitting to be in the river, et cetera, would all be covered by that program's funding.
Tracy, you have a question?
Yeah, can I ask the same, rather than having to go over there and repeat my question?
Okay, Tracy Martin has a question.
So it's actually it's actually, I'm asking for confirmation of something I think you said, and then I have a statement that you can tell me if I'm wrong. And I'm looking at Jackson. So the foundation work that you're describing relates to conditions that pre-exist the flooding. This is not related to flooding. Is that correct?
So the question is, the conditions that we're talking about, or the work on the foundation relates to conditions that existed before the flooding. Yes and no. The foundation hasn't, the condition of the actual concrete and stone hasn't changed noticeably. What's changed is the material under that corner of the foundation. There was material there before the flood. There isn't material there now, back about 3 feet, I think, is what Bob Neal estimated.
So follow up to that. Has the engineer been able to tell like what's under the main part of the foundation? Because some people have theorized that it looks like it could be on bedrock, at least a portion of it looks like it might be, but I don't know if they've tested that or if they can tell that.
So the follow-up was, do we know what's underneath the foundation? And yeah, no, we don't. I mean, what was there was loose enough to wash away. I don't think there's been no geotechnical survey work or anything done like that. And I don't know that anybody's looked deep enough to know how deep the bedrock goes.
We did geotechnical in preparation for the pedestrian bridge on that side of the bridge. I don't know if those cores would tell you anything, but they exist.
And I do think Bob has those and has looked at them. I think it's just sort of extrapolating those locations to the river or to that building is difficult, but.
Gotcha.
Ross?
I'm wondering, we're talking about the building, but if Civic Standard remains in the building, that seems to be one equation. But if the Civic Standard moves out and somebody else moves in, do all these things still stay in place? And, can you give us some idea of, does Civic Standard want to stay in the building, or do you want to move out of the building? And if so, what type of time frame are we talking about?
Okay, so this is a question from Ross Connolly about if the Civic wants to stay in that building or what the timeline is. There's one aspect, which is that it isn't in the mission of our organization, our small but mighty but very strained to capacity organization. Nowhere in our documents does it say that our mission is to save historic buildings. We also totally agree with the fact that the building is a big part of our story and of what we've done so far. And it is also, we're finding we are kind of filled to capacity with the possibilities of that particular space. If you've been to a Wednesday supper recently, you know that it's about as full as it can be. And we're glad that it's the season to move outside to the park because it's starting to feel kind of uncomfortable. And I know that there are people who don't attend that meal because it feels uncomfortably full. I also know there's people who don't attend that meal because it's not handicap accessible. And those two issues for us are really meaningful. The accessibility issue has been one that has really stuck out to us the whole time. And right away, I had a lot of urgency about that. And then I sort of stepped back and went, whoa, there's so many other things that have to happen before we can address the accessibility issue. So the headquarters is what, we consider that building to be. Obviously, we do a lot of programming in other places. So we could potentially start doing more programming in other places, but then it becomes even more insane for us to put as much capacity and resources into saving that building if we're finding ourselves doing things more and more elsewhere. So to that end, we are actively pursuing and looking at moving and looking at other options. And again, this is another one of these things that we're moving forward with at the same time that we're applying a lot of our time and energy into our work with Preservation Trust and into, every possible outcome of what this could look like. We don't know which one is, we're not like secretly holding information about we know exactly what's going to happen, because to move would put us in a very different financial position than we are having been donated a building with a lot of issues, but still not needing to carry a mortgage has made a lot possible for our organization. So to suddenly step into taking out a bank loan in order to move into another building is going to change our finances a little bit. But we're considering everything and we're actively pursuing it, and we just don't know exactly how it's going to pan out. But part of why I wanted to have this meeting was to see if there was community interest. If there were people, if there was a group, if there was, an organization that either wanted to form or that already existed that was interested in doing some of this work with us or under the umbrella of the Civic Standard or separate with Preservation Trust and with the full knowledge of what this building needs and what it would mean. We're totally open to all possibilities, and we're not going to just dump it. And that's why we're starting this conversation as soon as we possibly could, so we can see what kind of interest there might be and what partners we might be able to cultivate. Eric?
Should I come up and speak?
If you don't mind, that'd be great.
Start that off, yes. Start a trend.
So I just wanted to,
Say your name.
I am here. Great. So I just wanted to follow up on the foundation issue and whether you believe that a full restoration, jacking and repouring is necessary, because you talked about it being structural as it is right now.
Sure. I mean, I think the weakest point of the building that's been identified is the foundation. So if, there may be ways to do further repairs, I think those would be considered heavier Band-Aids maybe. I think ultimately it wouldn't hurt to have a new foundation under that building.
Okay. Because it's been there for a long time, been through a lot of water.
Right.
It hasn't moved that much.
Right.
And then my interest, of course, is in a more cohesive community contribution to the real estate and the buildings in this town. And so I'm just concerned about, the different permitting and all of these oversights that would jack up the cost of restoring and repairing it for use by the community. And so I'm here to say that I believe we have plenty of resources in this community to not get into subcontracting out to bonded, insured people and so forth. I mean, I myself have the ability to do all of these repairs, whether it's roof, painting, anything. I have years of experience in restoring buildings like this. I was the lead carpenter on the Hardwick Inn. I was the lead carpenter on restoring the co-op after the Bemis fire. The Hardwick Inn, we jacked up this end 11 inches, and even if it's not in that part of the stream, it is affected. That land keeps settling. You can go downstairs there and you can see it was jacked once before. The bricks downstairs are like this. So even if it isn't, singled out by stream experts and so forth, everything along the river is affected because of horizontal water and everything else. So there's only so much that we can, do in terms of standing up to Mother Nature. And so for me, it's a common sense thing to try to, rally the human beings who live in this community to actually be interested and do the work. Right? I myself would freely step in and do the work, no labor. I mean, if the materials are provided and you wanted to do some kind of quasi-insurance thing because you're afraid of my life, you could do that and I would do the work along with other people, and I'm sure we could bring in all kinds of other people who wouldn't charge. There would be no labor cost for any of the repairs to bring it up to the standard. And so my interest is, instead of going to all of this commercial, corporate, external, expensive oversight, that we actually take responsibility here in the town and utilize people like me who don't have anything better to do than be in service to things like this. So I'm just saying that, I would like to see us move away from giving up our ability to use the land by having FEMA have a lien on it or some federal group that's sending in money.
It's not a lien from FEMA. It's a deed requirement to keep it undeveloped because it's something that has flooded multiple times in other areas. This particular structure is in the floodway, and FEMA is interested, and we as a town are interested in moving things out. That's why we're doing 20 of these. We're
Right.
trying to get people and places, because, so let's take the worst case scenario, Eric. The building comes down, and it goes down, and it gets caught on Cottage Street Bridge, which means the Lamoille now goes into Granite Street and takes out those houses. That's the worst case scenario. And any scenario has to be, you have to look at the whole realm. Am I saying that's going to happen? No. But am I saying that we have to know what is possible? It is in the floodway. We have watched things that have been standing for years have now been impacted in the last 2 years. There is a woman in this town who has had 8 feet of water in her basement 6 times in the last 2 years. Her family has lived in that building for generations. They will tell you it has not been like that. Things are shifting. It's what been even referred to.
So if I can pull out a question from what you stated, it would be, why don't you take all of this goodwill and work that you know exists in this community and utilize it, right? Rather than go through these expensive and elaborate processes around engineering? Is this, am I
there's-
reading this correctly?
What you're saying is there's still oversight, because if you're going to try to paint the back of the building from the river, there needs to be a special permit. There's your insurance company's requirements because of that whole debacle. So I'm saying that if we can address this, I mean, I don't know if there's variances, if it's an ordinance, if we can say, okay, let's approach this from a common sense place and say, are we satisfying whatever the requirements are without going through the actual permit in a strict way? Because usually in municipal things, you can have a variance.
A variance is if there are no variances in the floodplain and the floodway.
Right.
And
And so what we're looking at is a very restrictive
Yes.
oversight from the state,
No, from the town.
from the town.
And
which-
the state.
And the state.
And the feds.
Right. Which
Every level. We're
Yes.
all trying to make nothing happen in the floodway. How's that?
Right, and so what that does, in my perception, is takes away the autonomy of the people of this town to all of these expensive commercial experts outside of our community, which is what I'm trying to work against, because none of us are valued enough in our life force right now to keep up with those external goods and services. So until we actually take control of our community by stepping up and being responsible for buildings and everything without getting into the scary predictions of what might and might not happen, right? We have to allow some of this to be through divine providence, right? We can't control anything in the future, right? So at a certain point, as reasonable human beings, we know that everything we build is going to be taken down by Mother Nature, right? Eventually, we all go back to the earth. So there's a certain point where there's a certain amount of common sense by saying, why are we using so much of our life resources to come up with this commercial money to restrict our abilities to take responsibility for our local infrastructure? So I'll leave it there.
I feel like the town manager should be here to answer these questions, but, yeah. Yes. Do you mind? You can do it.
I'm Chris Larson, and I'm just curious if there's been any serious investigation into the possibility of moving the building altogether. If that's, something that some towns are starting to realize that, if we're going to be maintaining our historic structures, the best situation is to keep them in their historic locations. But, if it's a question between, losing the structure altogether and potentially maintaining that as some use, some sort of housing, etc. This might be a particularly difficult case. I don't know if there's any open land nearby that it could be moved to, but I'm just curious if that's been investigated at all.
So I can tell you that we had one of the other buildings that is in the demolition, is in the acquisition queue, wanted to look into relocation. And I was told by Vermont Emergency Management they'd be willing, they hadn't done it, and they'd be willing to work on it, especially with Hardwick, because we've been able to meet all the different pieces that have to happen. And that did not work out, but if that was something that the town, the Civic Standard wanted to do, I'd pursue it with them. I would need help. It takes a little more bandwidth to be able to and they would need to find the property, or whoever is doing it would need to find the property. But there is theoretically the potential that the money could be utilized to relocate instead of demolition.
Yeah, well,
Especially since the demolition is going to be very expensive for this particular
it would be
structure.
valuable to look at, especially being one of the oldest buildings in the downtown.
I think that's like when we say run out all the possibilities, in my mind, there's three possibilities. One is that the building is saved and right where it is. Two, that it's torn down. Three, that it's moved. And I've had a similar conversation with Vermont Emergency Management. They have not done this before, but it is theoretically possible. I think it comes down to a cost-benefit analysis for them of like, how much would it actually cost to move the building and those kinds of
Yeah.
things. But, I think it's something, again, potentially worth exploring, and I think we're seeing that in Vermont. Like, I don't know, you folks, I'm sure, I don't know, have seen from Johnson, right? That they, that was a library that, almost 10 years ago, we had worked with them on flood mitigation efforts for where it is located right now, and they ultimately have made the decision, with help from the Vermont Department of Libraries, to move that building to a safer location. So I think all of these things kind of need to be on the table. From a preservation point of view, obviously, the historic streetscape is important in and of itself, and keeping buildings in the context of where they were built is important. But, the reality of the world that we're in is going to take a lot of compromise.
I think given the amount of money it will take to demolish, I think the cost benefit would probably work out. It needs to be something that's relatively local.
Yeah. It just seems like something that's statewide,
Yeah.
we need to be considering more, and who
So
knows?
I
Yeah.
made the offer to another owner, and we pursued it, and ultimately, they weren't able to find a piece of land.
Yeah.
And so that became the other part of that discussion.
Thank you.
But I'm willing to try.
June, do you have a question?
In relation to that, in Montpelier, then you know, you can speak to this perhaps, the houses on Route 2 going west.
Yeah. They're being elevated.
It has to elevate
Yep.
8 feet. FEMA's paying for that, correct?
That's actually a special allocation through the legislature
Okay.
that provided money for those elevations.
Which we have as well.
Because once you elevate, then you can move.
Yeah, we have that same money for elevations, but the structures have already been chosen, and they're all residential. They have to be residential for that.
I wasn't sure.
5 towns got that, and Hardwick was one of them.
Grace?
Did we get your name?
June, what's your last name? Jess. Grace has a question? You want to ask the microphone? Thank you.
Hi, Grace. And Kristen, you may have said this clearly, but I'm getting full up here, so.
Yeah, so am
I'm
I.
just wondering about the timeframes for all of this, because the flood corridor, is that what you're calling it?
The floodway.
Floodway, excuse me,
Yep.
that whole process is sort of discombobulated right now, it sounds like? When does that
No.
get looked at again, and when is there some kind of timeline for some consensus around how to deal with the whole floodway?
Oh, so,
I have a two-part question here,
yeah.
at least.
So we're in a holding pattern. We've tried 3 programs so far to fund looking at from Hayes to Cottage Street Bridge, because we know we have issues all throughout. There are flood walls that are falling, there's the retaining wall, there's multiple issues on that whole corridor. The problem being that if you make a change in one place, you may be impacting negatively another place. What I keep saying to people is we don't want to fix something and impact the village restaurant. So looking at it as a phased approach.
Then where would we go?
I know, where would we go? I don't know. Looking at it as a phased approach. Right now, we don't have the resources identified to do the plan. We've had 3 different approaches that have not worked out due to the complexity, due to federal monies changing. But I'm confident that Vermont Emergency Management sees this as a critical project and will help us find a path forward.
I mean, that seems like one of the basic parameters for the long
Yeah,
run.
there is
And then-
another pot of money that is opening that might be a match. And I can't speak further into it because it's still not open and open available for all the information, but we're working on it.
So then in terms of other timelines, so that's the kind of the long run picture and colors a lot of things for the whole downtown. Then there are the shorter term things around.
program.
The buyout
is
program.
probably about 2 years.
That's, so from now, from here? Okay. And then your insurance?
Oh, they're coming for us. I mean, I don't think they're gonna take another kicking the can. So, this year, we need to have like a plan and be
By
moving towards
December
it.
or like
Well, I mean, it's gonna be pretty hard to find like a painter this summer who's ready to go. But we already sort of kicked that last summer. So, yeah, I think we would need to be like signing on with somebody this calendar year. Or showing the next step of our, like, actually
So you
engaging
need
that.
some kind of a short-term commitment made in terms of what you want to do
Yeah,
within this
and we
year.
need to make sure that we
Okay.
can get that funding to do that work.
And if you were to move the building, the cost of dealing, I mean, does that leave you in a situation where in addition to the roof and everything else that you've already mentioned?
I don't know, I
Um,
have not
What about the
explored.
asbestos then and the lead then?
I have
Is that
not
stuff you
explored
have
the
to
moving the
deal with
building
if
in
you
any
keep
practical
using the
way.
building? Okay. And
Haven't.
if you were to keep it there, would those issues be additional expenses for you to?
Well, the lead's gonna make the painting more expensive, for sure, because you're gonna need to get like lead certified, you know, and do the scraping in a responsible way with the river there and all of that. But no, we haven't, I don't know, I haven't explored in any practical way, like the reality of any of those things beyond rough estimates. We've gotten estimates from painters and roofers because we were trying to show the insurance company, we are working on this, we are figuring it out. But we certainly do not have that funding completely in place for foundation painting and roof, like ready to go. We have a piece towards that.
Do you know what money you would get from the buyout that you could apply? perhaps
What
to
our
something else?
understanding is that it would be 240, basically.
Well, no, so
I
the
mean, this
rough
is all-
estimate that we're using is we have assessments. It's approximately 140,000 is the assessment. We've been finding that roughly properties are coming in, the appraisal value is coming in roughly 2 times that.
Okay.
Roughly, and that's, you
To
know,
see what,
I-
yeah, the pieces are.
yeah, and it's commercial, so it's a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
It's historic. I can't speak to it. But it's not 25,000. How's that?
I was just curious if that would give you the opportunity to purchase something else that maybe was worth more remediation
Yeah.
if it turned out that all of these other pieces don't come together. At the
We're
right-
we're not considering that money as part of our financial picture. We're looking at bank loans and ways that we could fundraise and grant write towards making a leap to a different building that would require more of a carrying cost. And if it was decided through like a community process like this one that the buyout was what happened, we'd sort of like get to that when we get to it. But we're not using that money to leverage to make a move, if that makes sense.
Nope, just curious. Thank you.
And my understanding is if we were to be creative with the buyout program and do a relocation, you wouldn't get money for the structure. You would just be getting the ability to move it.
I kind of assumed that, but thank you, yeah.
But I just want to add one thing, which is that if we do move and if we're able to pull that off, you know, in a shorter timeline, sooner than all these other timelines need to be answerable, we would be a small organization with the carrying costs of 2 buildings, which is going to be a real strain. And so we will have to figure out some ways to mitigate that for ourselves financially, either by sort of handing off the carrying costs of the building to somebody else in the short term as like a renter person in residence there, or figuring out a different path if we decide we're not going to stay in the buyout program.
Thank you.
Who has not had a chance to ask a question yet? Bill, do you want to ask?
I just got a quick
Yeah.
question. So, I've had a taste of that river, and I got a funny feeling come July, if something isn't done behind it, because I got down to the water tonight, that concrete's gonna flop in the river. And then part of that building's gonna be dangling and torn apart. So what is the plan? This is my question. What is your plan if you can't make up your minds and you don't repair that little corner
Great
or do something, and we get July 10th, 25?
So Ben Matthews is here. He's a river scientist, and he, you might remember him from Christmas Carol. He played the he played the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, and now he's going to reenact that role.
Yes.
And tell us about the flood
Ho,
yet
ho,
to
ho.
come. Yeah.
The question's not the flood, it's
Yes.
If it floods,
But
what are
this
you
is,
gonna do with the
but
building?
yes, and if you would just share what you shared with me about that short-term need.
Yes, so to speak to the recurrence interval of the flood, so I'm a river scientist. I was the river management engineer for the past 2 floods here and spoke with Rose about this issue in July 23. I can't speak to whether or not we're gonna see this happen again. The statistics that we have just don't support that right now. We don't have enough data to be able to say what it is, but we can say, I think, pretty confidently that the normal statistics which said that was anywhere from a 100 to a 200-year storm are not accurate anymore. That recurrence interval is going to happen probably more frequently. Whether or not it's a 2-year storm or a 50 or a 75, I can't tell you. We just don't have enough data. But what we've seen is that it's probably more likely because we're getting more rain. The immediate short-term fix to stabilize buildings that are in danger of causing more of a problem should they go into the river, that's something that can be permitted to put some rock in front of that foundation and to solve that as a short-term fix. The issue with that is what Kristen brought up, which is the building's in a floodway. What being in a floodway means is that those buildings back water up behind them because they're constricting the flow. It's kind of like putting your thumb over a fire hose, and the water behind that increases the water elevation so that things will flood upstream of there greater than they will downstream. And that's actually how you model that, and how FEMA determines that is saying these buildings are causing higher floods for people upstream, which is why they're in the floodway. If you put more rock in there, you're increasing that at base elevation, which is increasing that flood level upstream that much more, which is why it's not allowed, why FEMA has the regulations, why the town has those regulations. It's does seem sort of overbearing, federal and permitting and oversight and all of that, but in this case, it's very much about protecting the community because they don't want to allow more flooding to happen. If you do this here, you'll cause exponentially worse problems upstream. So it could happen in the short term because they know the risk of that building going in is significant, but it would have to have a plan to eventually either take the building down or come up with a more permanent solution that will not raise the base flood elevation. That gets done by modeling. There's a bunch of processes that can go through that, but that's a concern at that site. The other thing that I just wanted to say is that that point in the river is a constriction point because it's in a floodway, but it immediately opens up after that. And that, when rivers do that, you get vortices. If you've gone down and seen a river go around a bend and you see an eddy, that water, when it starts doing that, has a lot of velocity and a lot of ability to erode. So not just addressing something right there in that point, without looking downstream and without looking upstream is not really considering the full breadth of the issues that you could see there. The third and last point I'll make is the river in these last 2 floods changed dramatically. And it is not the same river that we grew up with. It's not the same river that anyone's memory has anymore. It changed dramatically both in the geometry that it has, which changes the amount of power and velocity it has, and the amount of sediment that's coming in because of all of those hill slopes that you see. They're big scars as you drive up Route 16 and you drive up Route 15. All of that stuff comes into the river and changes the dynamics and changes where it has those eddies and gives it a lot more instability, and it makes it more dynamic and harder to predict. So it's not useful in my professional estimation to compare to previous conditions of the river because it's not the same river anymore. And I'll shut up there.
Do you want to talk about that temporary fix just a little more, like to explain how we're getting around that base flood elevation thing?
Sure. I mean, the plan that's getting submitted to the DRB is essentially to put some more material back, or to put concrete underneath that corner that is missing material, and to repoint the stone part of the foundation to keep water, to keep a lot of water from coming into it, and also just to give it a little more stability. So it wouldn't be. That's working within the footprint of the existing foundation as opposed to adding more material. So that's the short-term repair.
But does that thing of buying a little bit more time
Right.
for us to figure out what the long-term solutions would be?
And the timing would be timing with potential work on the suspension bridge to get into the river this summer to do that work.
Can you replace the material that was taken out without getting into the permit thing?
We have to go through a permit. The DRB does require a DRB permit.
Even if it existed.
Yep.
The dynamic doesn't change because
Right.
it existed.
Yeah, and my understanding, Kristen, is that even like putting a new roof on would require a DRB permit. I mean, basically any work done on the building
Yeah.
requires.
That's the thing about being in a floodway.
Right.
That's one of the main drags, is that you need so much permitting to do anything. I mean, including some stuff in the interior, we would need to do a DRB
No,
application.
everything in the interior.
Yeah,
I didn't hear about that.
I know,
that-
I know,
that-
I
yeah.
know, I know. Apologize later, yeah. Tracy?
So, two things. One is our DRB are just our own citizens, and they're not gonna be mean. They're just thoughtful citizens that volunteer to be on the DRB. So I don't think we need to be scared of the DRB. The other thing is just that we are designated downtown now, which is a relatively new thing for Hardwick. It means we have a nonprofit, the Hardwick Downtown Partnership, and part of their mission is preservation. That's what the downtown program is all about. So I'm wondering if there isn't a role for the downtown partnership in this conversation, because if it's about so maybe they could help the civic get extricated from the, maybe the downtown partnership could have a role finding a different steward for the building, if that turns out to be something that people are open to. I just feel like there's this organization in place that's very focused on the downtown and its historic, the built environment, and that maybe that could somehow come into play here.
Can I just talk about, so yes, the DRB are local citizens and they're lovely people. In fact, I see a few of them in the audience tonight. But what they have to work with the structure, the statute structures. Anything that's going to the floodplain or floodway has to go to the floodplain manager at the state level. We happen to have a woman, she has 30 days to review and provide response. And if there's a response that needs more information, we then have to wait and get that information. You then have a hearing. After a hearing, there is a 30-day window that the decision can be made. Most of the time, the DRB has their decision made in 5 days, but they have 30 days to make a decision. You then have a 30-day window of appeals. So doing a roof could take you up to 3 months. So that is the other piece to, when Rose came to tell me that this was the building they were looking at, I said, you're gonna, it's not impossible, it's just there are more hoops. And so that's the time hoop. So we have a hearing for the DRB on May 7th.
Yeah, something like that.
I think it's May 7th, I believe. And that is for the painting, the foundation, and the roof. But that also, we had to really scramble to put that all together because we were trying to match the other timelines. Okay, it's not just that you can say, I want a permit, and 15 days later you have a permit. It's a little bit different of a process, and that's the point. Not that the DRB is going to listen to the merits and they are not going to be unreasonable, but they are going to be bound by the statutes, which give those timeframes.
Catherine? Oh,
Just want to
sorry.
make the point, you do need you will need a stream alteration permit.
Yes, and we're having a hard time getting a hold of our stream alteration person.
Let's talk.
Just saying. Just saying. That's why I miss you.
Hi,
Thanks, Ben.
I'm Catherine, and I'm not from Hardwick originally, but I am from Vermont, bred and buttered. And I moved to Hardwick a couple of years ago, and for the first year, because of a family health emergency, I didn't meet or know anybody. And then I walked into the door of the Civic, and I was given literally a life-saving community. And I won't go into details about that, but it's extraordinary what the Civic Standard is doing, and we've had this really robust conversation that is so important about the preservation of the building and what that means for the town. But I think a really, really important part of this conversation is about the preservation and protection of the civic standard as well. And making sure that that's being held in equal weight as we weigh these options and sort of potentialities for what can happen. The building is extraordinary and very special. But this organization is doing so much for so many of us, and they're so small. They're incredible human beings that are working insane hours. And that, so perhaps I would invite some of you maybe at the Preservation Society or Rose yourself to talk about the incredible amount of time that is going into just weighing these possibilities, right? Just the organization of this meeting is hours and hours of time, let alone all of these things that we're talking about, weighing all the applications, everything that's been done, all of the visits. Am I wrong in saying we're talking about hundreds of hours? And then to protect the building is an additional extraordinary amount of time. And I'm not saying that is a bad idea. I'm just saying the Civic also needs to continue to do their work. It's essential work. So if there is a hunger to protect this building, I think it does have to come out of the community. I mean, that's what I would offer. I'm not saying that it should be taken from anybody. I'm just saying I think this is a really important part of the conversation, is that we are protecting the work the Civic Standard is doing here, as well as the potential of what the building can be and what can happen with it in the future. So am I wrong in what I'm saying about what kind of time commitment are we talking about for someone to actually preserve this building? It's quite a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I would say, and we've talked about this, with Rose, and, I'm happy to say it here too. I talked earlier about Preservation Trust caring enough about this issue that we, making a commitment to help with like different engineering studies or whatever it takes to explore the options. That includes like capacity. If there needs to be like a separate kind of project manager or additional staff capacity that's needed, I think we're open to, working as hard as we can to try and build that additional capacity. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's not, we work with a variety of groups with different levels of capacity around the state, and some of them have internal capacity and it's within their mission to take on these projects, and some do not. And we're lucky enough to have some good project managers who can come in and provide that extra capacity. But yeah, it's no joke. It's a lot of work and a lot of time.
And as someone who produces films, which is not an indirect relationship, right? You're producing a large-scale project. Even having someone take over that management, there's still a huge amount of oversight to be done around that person, right? There's a ton of reading of documents, of looking at things, of considering, of inviting in the community. Those are all also things that take. So it's not as easy. I might offer, that's an incredible thing to be gifting, potentially, but it's not as easy. It's not as if then the project gets completely handed off to that person. Is that right? So that's just something I'd love to have be a part of the conversation.
Thanks, Catherine. Paul?
All right, I'm going to take off my editor-reporter hat and put on my vice chair of the board of Northeast Kingdom Public Journalism, which is the owner of the Hardwick Gazette. Okay. Rose and I talked briefly, and I don't think we discussed anything there that isn't out on the table here. Our board met the other day after I had that information and knew this was coming on. The Gazette is happy in Greensboro. We have a very low rent. Greensboro has been very nice to us. But we are the Hardwick Gazette. And the organization wishes the building had not left the hands of the Hardwick Gazette. If there is a path to returning to that building, being on Main Street where people walk in to share news with us, to donate at this point because we're not a for-profit entity, we'd love to be in that building. And doing the work we do, we see other towns. Preservation Trust's been involved in several projects in Calais where they took old buildings and rebuilt them, different parameters around them. We see that the Headwaters Trust in Craftsbury is going to take the donation of property from the Presbyterian Church and then lease it to,
That's not true yet, that's under consideration.
is under consideration. I'm sorry about that. A finer point is needed. At any rate, there are, let me just be general, there are village trust initiatives that take ownership of various buildings, handle that capacity issue to get through needs, and then make them available in various ways to the community. So all I'm really here to say is that if that building can be saved in its current location, the Hardwick Gazette would be interested in being a first floor tenant. And I think, to throw out another thought, people have lived upstairs in that building in the past. It's certainly habitable if other things happen to make it available to be insured and other things, that the Gazette could easily coexist with housing, which is also needed in Hardwick. So I think that's all I have to say at this point. But in hearing what I'm hearing, I think there are many more hours of conversations to have. And I don't know, we haven't heard from you what you envision coming out of this meeting, and I'd love to hear what that looks like.
I don't particularly want to control or imagine what the outcome should or could be, because I think that's less interesting than what could potentially happen with the combination of people and their inspiration. But like I said, there's a lot of different ways that collaboration and other people and organizations stepping in a little bit more could help to move this forward. We obviously have tremendous support from Preservation Trust. They've identified that this building is worth saving. And we also, I hope we've shared like the tremendous number of challenges and the complexity that are inherent in saving this building, and in really any work that you do on this building. It's complicated. But, you know, if the Civic can help to facilitate that, obviously we would be interested in doing that. If we move and we are still the owners, which we will be until something else happens, we will continue to be the owners. We would still be interested in helping to partner in some way, but being always mindful of capacity when we do that. Not just saying like, oh sure, we'll just go ahead and take on, you know, helping a group of people to figure out how to form a nonprofit and to take on carrying this building. But as an umbrella 501c3 with existing status, with our relationships that we've built, and if we can help with that, those resources in place for somebody else to step in, even over a period of a few years, that seems totally worth considering. You know, people say, I would love to help, and people say, I would be interested in being a tenant. Those are great things, but we're still missing the base underneath that, which is, you know, the amount of sleepless nights and intensive brain function required to have the meetings that are beyond the brain power of most people, I think, myself being the very first in line there. I'm not meant to have these conversations. This is not what my brain was shaped to do. And, you know, probably if you want somebody to save this building, you don't want a theater director to be the one who's trying to save it, because that's not what I was meant to be working on. But I think what it really requires is that somebody just has a complete commitment to seeing it all the way through. And that can be one person, that can be a small group of people, it can be an organization. We can help to be the organization that holds those people and their energy. Anything is possible.
And let me add, I'd intended to say, we have the same capacity issues on the Gazette board as you do. Putting out a weekly newspaper takes the same kind of commitment.
Does seem to be your mission, yeah.
And, but we also are a nonprofit. If there were a path that our 501c3 nonprofit could help you transition out for something, there are lots of issues here that, as I said, need discussion.
Natasha.
Just want to clarify, so right now there are funds to do a little bit the foundation work. with the-
Yeah.
And I know there's been estimates to really not full estimates that you get from a construction company, but we have some back of the envelope numbers of financially what the building needs. That has not been shared. I don't know if that would be helpful for people to understand, or if everyone sort of has a sense of that, but I do think that should be understood, especially if it's, if it's gonna be part of the community's, decision to understand.
Do you want to speak to that?
You're looking at me?
Yeah, I'm looking at you.
I don't have estimates on it. Jackson, do you?
I mean, we don't have estimates or guesstimates on the
Because the
Band-Aid
new
approach,
one is
because that's a
different.
pretty fresh idea.
The bigger one was 60, I think.
Right, the big armoring down below the foundation was estimated at 60,000. I don't know what you all have gotten for estimates on roofing. You were working on that for a while.
Trying
You
to
were working on
remember.
painting, so I don't know those numbers.
Painting was 40. I can't remember what roofing is, but I can find
I
it.
think it would be unreasonable to say
Yeah.
that to fix the building, that it would cost like $1 million.
I don't think it would.
Like, what's, like-
No.
And it depends how you're defining. I mean, if you're doing to fix the foundation, put a roof on, and paint it, is probably I wouldn't want to throw a number out, but less than $1 million for sure.
Less than $1 million.
Opie says 4, but 4 million. No, 400. Yeah.
The dream solution.
Yeah, a full foundation is hundreds of thousands,
But
but
short term, the roof, what you need to get insurance and shore up that point.
Mm-hmm.
What's the ballpark? And are there funds available?
I can tell you what we have done is we, before this all came up, we were able to make an allocation of $100,000 to support this building, right? That's what we had made a commitment to. And so, the short-term fixes, the kind of due diligence on the building, we believe that it's totally appropriate to use some of that funding to answer those questions or to stabilize the building enough that the due diligence can be done. It doesn't mean that you should throw good money after bad, right? In terms of like restoring something that, we don't even know if we're gonna keep a year from now, right? So, that was the original allocation that was made, and I think we're trying to determine like what is the best stewardship of those funds, because frankly, like if they don't go into that building, they're gonna go into another historic building that, also needs work and needs to be preserved for the future, right? And so that's the kind of thing that we're trying to balance, but we also don't want to, a building that's been around that long and been an important part of a community's history should not get the short end of the stick, right? Like I think we have made a commitment to invest enough in it to know really what the decision points are. And I really want to emphasize, those are not the Preservation Trust of Vermont's decision. Our mission is to build community through the preservation of historic buildings, right? And so what matters to us is conversations like this one that build the community capacity to discuss hard issues about historic buildings. And, ultimately it's going to be up to the civic standard or the next steward of this building to determine what's going to happen. Our job is to support them as much as we can.
Yeah, Emily.
I'm just curious, there hasn't been any conversation about like alternative locations, and to me, the building is important because of its central location in town, and that is really valuable to the civic standard, and its role in the community, and it's hard for me to imagine you guys being like 5 miles out of town or something.
Yeah.
There's not that much real estate in town, so that feels like another part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. That's a different meeting. That's a different meeting, yeah. And that meeting might happen eventually. I mean, when we were looking for spaces, we said we just need a door on Main Street. That was my theme sentence. Just if I had a door on Main Street, this whole project would sort of open up, which in fact it did. And I mean, beyond what I even could have imagined. And it's completely about the location, I think. And the building itself was a very beautiful and has been a very beautiful emblem for the work that we were trying to establish. Even though we consider ourselves a mobile community center and we set that up wherever we happen to be doing a project, but the meaning of a building that housed the newspaper felt really prescient for us from the very beginning. But I think the fact that kids can walk to, from both schools, and that people happen by us because of doing their shopping or doing errands is also deeply meaningful, just where we happen to find ourselves. But I think also the fact that we're now in this conversation is as a project of the Civic Standard to grapple with this big question about a historical building in the middle of downtown is meaningful also. So we don't shrug that off. We just want to be careful about mission drift. We want to be careful that it doesn't become all about that. And that doesn't eclipse the bigger things that we have on our plate that we want to get to, all the projects and all the events and all the things we want to keep building. Ray.
I'm Ray Lewis. I live up in Walden, but I try to be active at the Civic, and I'm a sugar maker now, but I was a builder in a previous life. I restored a lot of old buildings. I lived in a very old house. And to me, it doesn't really, the building, if it were not in the floodway, I wouldn't consider that building to be that bad as far as its shape. Obviously being the floodway makes that a very different situation. But with that in mind, I think that one thing that we need to have some perspective on is that it should really be in the state and the town's interest to keep that building upright through this July. And whatever we do, it's gonna rain.
Believe me, I know.
Okay? And I just want to say that, personally, I'm an avid fly fisherman, angler, and I have fished everywhere on this river, and wherever it is completely different. And I say that some of that difference is due to the state and the work that they have done to armor the banks. And my feeling is that if the state can make the decision that they can put an excavator in the river and do the things that they do in there, then they should be able to help us through this point that we're at and keep this building from ending up blocking the Cottage Street Bridge and causing much more damage. And so I'd like to see where are our representatives in the State House in this conversation, and have they and others putting some pressure on the state and asking them where are they in this conversation.
I forgot to invite them.
Next meeting.
I really did.
So I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that
I realized it earlier
fault for
today,
not
but.
being here, but I'm saying that that's how you
Yep.
work through some of these things.
Yep.
Is by making connections and applying pressure where you can. But as the person who spends a lot of time in the river, I cannot believe that they put those machines in the river. I really can't. And it's not just here, it's throughout the state. And they channelize the river, and that's what causes this kind of problem, in my personal opinion. I've seen it. So let them take some ownership and help us do this.
So I think when we put out the first email to our newsletter about these considerations and the sort of where we were at this fork in the road and all that, we did hear back from like 30 people or so who wrote really thoughtful, responses and just ideas and feedback. And so we continue to invite that, like in whatever form, to come and talk to us, to write an email in any way. And obviously you have now a sense of the timeline of that decision-making process that we're engaged in. And I hope that you see like some of the opportunities and some of the possibilities for partnership and for involvement. But yeah, I just encourage everybody to like continue to ask questions, and I'll try to direct people to the experts that have the actual information beyond my limited understanding. Are there last thoughts that we want to share? Kristen, have we missed anything important?
Not that I can think of.
You want to say
Well, I'll
something?
just say I want to thank you, Rose,
Mhm.
for for your leadership on this. Because I said it before. Sometimes buildings choose us; we don't choose them, and it's not easy what you're doing. And but it's really important, and you're providing really a service to the community, but to the larger community in Vermont for doing it in such a thoughtful way and really not shying away from what's a really challenging issue that we're all going to have to face. And, I just hope you feel the energy of people behind you and supporting you.
Yeah. I don't in any way want to cut off the conversation or the questions, and they can just continue. We can continue to talk. I just want to make sure people don't feel held here beyond about 8 o'clock. So yeah, feel free to stick around and come talk to any of us here if you're willing to stay just a few minutes longer. Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. Mhm.